Hello, everybody. Are people able to hear me? No. No? Oh, there we go. Okay. Now, yes. Thank you for joining us today for our event hosted by the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, for which IISD is supporting. We've got a group in the room already, but we're also live streaming this event on the web as well. We know it's a Saturday afternoon. Folks have had a long week, so we'll try to keep it relatively casual, and we'll get you out of here in time to be able to grab some lunch. But we do thank you for taking the time to join us today. What we're talking about today is really the relation between global stocktake and fossil fuel subsidy reform and shifting other public financial flows, such as investment, issues like taxation, those sorts of things. Very briefly, I'm Philip Gass. I'm the lead for transitions with the IISD Energy Program. IISD serves as a secretariat for the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. And we'll be talking a little bit about submissions to the Stocktake. We had one that we made ourselves that my colleague Jonas will put up on the screen a little bit later that you're able to follow. And we're also going to hear from a few of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform members, as well as some experts on the topic of subsidies from various international organizations. Just very briefly, the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform is a group of non-G20 countries that came together in 2010 to advocate for the inclusion of fossil fuel subsidy reform as an environmental measure to achieve things like mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but also free up revenue to support energy transition and the delivery of other goals, and lately talking about potential linkages with other issues such as just transition. With that, I'll maybe pause there, and I'll invite our two keynote speakers today to join me up at the desk, if you don't mind, Dr. Ben Abraham and Carolina Antonin. While they're coming up, Ben Abraham is filling in for Kay Harrison today. Ben, who is the head of the New Zealand delegation. New Zealand is the chair of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, and Ben is a senior advisor on climate finance policy with the New Zealand delegation. So maybe, Ben, I'll turn it over to you to provide our initial opening comments. Thank you.
Hello, is this working?
Yep.
Great. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Greetings to all, and welcome to this event, and thanks very much for the introduction. I'm not the head of the New Zealand delegation, that's Kay, but yes, I'm a senior advisor for finance and work on our finance negotiations and climate finance policy. So it's a pleasure on behalf of Aotearoa New Zealand and the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform to welcome you here and just provide a couple opening remarks. I think the real content and the value of this event will come from the speakers to follow, so I won't take too much of your time. But yes, just to pass on the apologies of Ambassador Kay Harrison, who's stuck co-facilitating the mitigation work program, so is unable to join us today. But I'm very happy to be here on her behalf. So to achieve the Paris Agreement, we know there's an urgent need to redirect financial flows away from high emissions activities and towards low greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable development. And really, it's great, more timely than ever, to be able to be here and talk specifically about perhaps the most egregious form of finance flows that are not aligned with those objectives, which is fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies, they're wasteful, they disincentivize investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. The IEA suggested in 2022 that we have over $1 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies, approaching their highest levels ever. And also, we've further seen in recent years with the illegal invasion of Russia into Ukraine, how that has kind of highlighted the energy security concerns associated with the fossil fuel dependent economy and the fiscal concerns that come with those as well, and really highlights that need to accelerate even more quickly towards renewable energy systems. And the IPCC has shown that even with existing fossil fuel infrastructure, it could be enough emissions associated with those to take us past the 1.5 degree temperature limit to which we're all working. And there's urgent need for further finance to accelerate the mitigation and adaptation activities that are currently not ambitious enough, not occurring fast enough. And with the scale of fossil fuel subsidy reforms, is an incredible opportunity to help redirect and rechannel some of that finance towards the action that we so badly need. So today, ask for you two things for the event. Follow the science. Please bring us the best and most robust evidence available to help us in this effort. And we're very lucky to have some, fantastic experts joining us today to, I think, help us do just that. And secondly, I'd be interested in, hearing your ideas about the opportunities we have as countries within the UNFCCC to accelerate and advance this work. Where do you see the opportunities within the program this year and in future years? Whether it's the Global Stocktake, the Just Transitions Work Program, the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c, and hopefully an agenda item on the topic at COP next year. How can we take advantage of those opportunities? So I'll be listening out for those because the matter is urgent, so please make the most of the event today, and I look forward to the discussions. Ngā mihi nui, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate the support of New Zealand with Friends and on this issue of subsidy reform as well, and we'll continue to, I'm sure, have events together. Caroline Antonen is our other representative today, speaking on behalf of Finland. She's an expert in the field of international climate negotiations, carbon pricing, and the EU ETS, and has experience negotiating in international EU and national contexts. She's had a number of different positions in Finnish ministry since 2006, currently with the Ministry of Environment, and was also seconded to the European Commission for 2 years as an expert. She has a master's degree in economics and environmental policy from the University of Tampere and a master's degree in law from the University of Helsinki. Finland is another supporter of the Friends and has done some efforts in regards to subsidy reform over the past years, including being a key member of the Friends since their inception. So, Caroline, thanks for being with us here today, and I'll turn it over to you for a few remarks.
All right, thanks a lot, and on my part as well. Good morning or day. It's very nice to be here today. And just as Ben here, I have been sent here by my head of delegation, Outi Honkatukia, who is unable to attend due to her facilitating duties. And I'm going to provide you a slightly more technical intervention than Ben did. I'm going to talk about the example of Finland and the work that we're currently doing when mapping out our own environmentally potentially harmful subsidies. So I'm not only talking about fossil fuel subsidies, it's environmentally harmful subsidies. And of course, what you need to know about Finland is that we have generally a very high level of taxation in many fields. So typically in our country, these subsidies are tax rebates or lowered tax rates instead of direct subsidies, budgetary subsidies, but we have those as well. And in 2021 budget, we estimated that we would have had subsidies with potentially harmful elements for 3.2 billion euros. So it's not little. But however, this database, even in a country like Finland, this is not updated regularly. So we have now commissioned a study by the Finnish Environment Institute to look at the levels of direct budgetary subsidies and tax rebates, and where they're going and what their environmental impacts may be, which is often very, very hard to assess, in fact. And we should have had interim results for you. We don't. We're very sorry for that. So I will only be able to offer fairly general remarks on that. So the sectors where we often identify these subsidies, they are, in terms of direct subsidies, it's agriculture and forestry, unsurprisingly. And then in terms of tax rebates, lower tax rates, it's energy and transport. And you can find tax rebates for energy-intensive industry, lower electricity tax for industry in general, lower tax rate for peat, and of course free allocation when it comes to the emissions trading system. In the field of forestry, agriculture, particularly agriculture, the subsidies that are received, they are based on the surface area, which does not really provide an incentive for reforestation. It provides an incentive to maintain your agricultural area fairly large, even if you were not really doing efficient production on it. And also, if you have made way for your, fields and crops by turning peatland into agriculture land, that has, a large impact in terms of climate. We do have some positive development happening. We have an environmental compensation system in the agriculture, which in turn incentivizes emission reductions. But anyway, currently the situation is that there are direct subsidies that do have climate impacts and other environmental impacts. I'll come to that a little bit later. When commissioning and when advancing with this study, we have identified a few challenges. One of them is that there is actually no established definition for an environmentally potentially harmful subsidy. So we've had to work on that a little bit first, and we came up with the OECD definition, which means that a subsidy is harmful if the environmental harm is greater than in the absence of the subsidy. But it's, however, hard to know what may happen without that subsidy. So you're working with uncertainties here. There's not very much empirical studies to be found either, and it's kind of, yeah, this is a challenge. But anyway, this is where we have ended up with. Also, when looking at the tax subsidies, tax rates, the challenge is in finding the right reference level. Often what has been done is that you compare the size of the subsidy to the sort of so-called normal tax rate in the event of a tax rebate, for example, but that may not really speak to the environmental impact of that particular subsidy. So now this time we're using effective carbon tax rates as the reference level. So this means that, for example, if you have a fuel tax rate that is lower than the effective tax rate, so you're sort of imagining like an optimal tax system with effective carbon taxes. At that point, if your fuel tax rate is lower than the effective tax rate, then you could see that the tax rate utilized is a potentially harmful subsidy. And at that point, what the interesting question is, where do you set the effective tax rate level to? So what we have chosen to do in our study is that we have 3 different effective tax rates: 60 euros per tonne, 100 euros per tonne, and 120 euros per tonne. And of course, results are very different when you're looking at these different tax rates. For example, for our fuel tax rates. So you need to bear that in mind. And also for the direct budgetary subsidies, we are widening the scope of our study so that we're encompassing environmentally potentially harmful subsidies. So we don't need to have certainty that the subsidy causes environmental harm, but that there is a potential. So it covers a wider range of subsidies at that point. And we also have a new feature, which sort of stems from the CBD COP15 outcome, because we are going to have to start mapping out subsidies and the incentives that are harmful for nature. So this sort of speaks to biodiversity loss, particularly. And we'll also need to identify instruments that would accelerate biodiversity loss. So we're also taking that into account in our study. In terms of our CBD obligations, we need to finish by 2025. We're hoping to have the results of this study next year. There will be interim results in the autumn, so we're hoping to be able to tell you more about those soon. And what sort of indications we can find from the ongoing study is that we need a very comprehensive review, in particular in the area of agriculture. We need to take into account not just financial subsidies, but also other instruments like information guidance, etc., established practices, recommended practices, and so on and so forth. And also we need to start identifying environmental harm that is not currently taxed at all, like biodiversity loss, like the use of wood-based fuels. So when you're looking at a subsidy, potentially harmful subsidy, you need to have a very wide look at it, look at the ecological, fiscal, social impacts, and you need to measure whether the benefits are greater than the harm, and in particular, whether the subsidy is something that directs you to a new, well, green transition, or whether it's something that helps you maintain the established practices, which may not be climate friendly, and also how the subsidy, what the sort of income distribution impact of that subsidy is. But I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing from the actual experts in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and don't worry, Jonas and I are already thinking about having a COP event where we invite you to present on the subsidy report then. So thank you both very much for joining today, and of course to your delegations for providing support for the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. I think we'll give you a break from the very warm lights, and maybe we'll transition, we'll bring up our technical experts, but thank you very much, both of you, for joining today.
Thank you, thank IISD.
Yeah. So we have 3 experts, 2 in the room and 1 online. I'd like to invite Suzanne and Mauricio to come up on the stage. And while we do that, I'll introduce Suzanne, who will be our first speaker. Suzanne Ulbrich works with the United Nations Development Program since 2008, where she focuses on climate finance, has been co-developing the UNDP methodologies for climate finance and biodiversity finance, and has been leading work on climate finance assessments for mitigation and adaptation. Prior to this, she worked on water issues for the UNESCO in Bangkok, as well as the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. She's worked with the UN Environment Program in Nairobi on environmental education and with GIZ in India on water and sanitation. I'll turn it over to you, Suzanne, and I think you have some slides where we'll try to get those up on the screen. There we go. So
Great.
Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here contributing to this event with this very timely topic. I will start by broadening the topic a bit to saying, yes, we need fossil fuel subsidy reforms, and it is part of what UNDP is doing on the larger field of helping countries to reallocate finance from a brown agenda towards a green agenda. And as we know already from the IEA, is that the financing gap to really move to a net zero future is estimated at $8 trillion per year. And that means it's actually 9 million per year minus about 1 trillion per year that the world is currently spending on this. This gap is the largest in emerging markets and in developing economies. And it is also largest in certain sectors, such as the power sector, transport sector, and also the gap is likely to widen going forward in the coming years as the cost of mitigation keeps increasing over time, as we all know. Many countries have already made quite bold pledges to address this issue, but we also see that much of that is kind of hidden in the conditional pledges as opposed to the unconditional pledges. So it's also pending the provision of financing by the international community. If we move to the next slide. So how to really shift public finance towards greener development? This really remains one of the key activities what also UNDP is doing with countries. The various programs and initiatives that UNDP is doing with countries globally come together under an overall framework which we call the Climate Promise. And this Climate Promise is supposed to be a promise from UNDP towards countries in helping them to create ambitious nationally determined contributions and to really implement them nationally in countries. So as we know, still a large proportion of global public finances is devoted to fossil fuel subsidies, and of course they will need to be reallocated towards the green agenda. And this could mainly, what at least we are also working towards, is to reallocate them towards aspects such as social protection, renewable energy, and further development initiatives that would include infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, health and education, the promotion of energy efficiency and green transport, green agriculture, as well as further research and development in green technologies. If we go to the next slide, we see a snapshot on the situation of global fossil fuel subsidies. And we see a progression over time starting from 6 years back. And not very surprisingly, we're seeing somewhat of a decrease around 2020 when just the consumption of fossil fuels decreased due to the pandemic that the world was going through. And we also see that this is already increasing again. We see that we have quite different levels of fossil fuel subsidies according to the different world regions. So we see quite a few in Europe, Central Asia. We see also quite a few in Middle East, North Africa. But basically also what we can see is that this is really a phenomenon that regards all the different world areas. If we go to the next slide, we will see a bit of a breakdown. So if the fossil fuel subsidies in the different regions, what do they go to? And we see that in certain areas, there's more subsidies going into the petroleum sector. In others, it's more going into natural gas, such as in Europe. More petroleum, we see Middle East, North Africa, but then we see electricity being subsidized across the board in the different regions. So if we move to the last slide, then the way in which UNDP is approaching this with countries is by helping to develop sustainable strategies, both for the long-term planning, which is usually manifested in national development plans, but then also in the medium term, which is more the strategic action plans. So what would that be in more concrete terms? So there's a number of different approaches, methodologies that UNDP is using, but I'm just picking one as an example. So UNDP is doing financial assessment with countries. So these financial assessments are supposed to help countries to develop a financial scenario into the future and to say, okay, if we just continue doing what we are currently doing and extrapolate this into the future, say until 2030 or 2050, depending on what the national planning horizon is, then this would be the financial flows, this would be the costs that are associated with it, this would be the main actors and players that would be funding activities. And then compared to this business as usual scenario, countries also develop what we call a target scenario, and that would include like the actual implementation of the NDC, of the national targets. It would mean also breaking down these overall targets. We know all in the NDCs, typically they are still quite general, quite visionary. It takes also quite a lot of work to really break this down into more concrete steps of action. And if these get really mapped out into a scenario, then countries can really see, okay, if we do address climate change, it will cost us so and so much, but compared to inaction, we're also saving. And that's the actual benefit what countries get in doing this kind of thing, is that it helps policymakers to really make a business case for action. Because still in so many countries, of course, climate action is being purely regarded as like a costing factor. But doing this type of assessment helps countries actually see the cost of inaction, and not only in very general terms and not only in very general price tags, but in a very disaggregated form, saying, okay, so we would need to shift funding from here to there, from this source to that source. The assessments include both public finance as well as private finance, and to the extent that data is available, even household level finance. So it really gives an indication of where finance also has to shift the existing finance within a country, but then also to meaningfully identify the gap of what needs to be increased from what kind of sources for what kind of activities, which in turn, as one can imagine, also helps countries' chances to actually mobilize this finance. If they can go to the global community, not only in occasions like here these 2 weeks, in saying, we, country X, need so and so much to do ABC, as if saying, we, country X, need, we don't know exactly how much, but a lot. So this is one of the examples what we do. I know that time is limited. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I do hope we'll get some time to have some discussion as well and take some questions. I think, though, we will move to our online speaker next, and hopefully we can have Claire and her presentation behind us. Claire Potvin is an economist with a focus on public finance and green fiscal policies, working for the Economic and Trade Policy Unit at the United Nations Environment Program on topics related to harmful subsidies and nature and climate-positive fiscal incentives. She's previously worked with UNDP, as well as the Asian Development Bank and the Ministry of Finance for Timor-Leste. So, Claire, I turn it over to you, and I know you've got some slides for us as well today.
Yes, hello. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, hello everyone. Very happy to be here as well. Sorry I can't be here in person. But yeah, I'll focus my presentation today on the SDG indicator 12C1 on the measure of fossil fuel subsidies. Maybe, oh, sorry, can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So first, a quick outline of my presentation. I'll give a brief overview of the landscape of fossil fuel subsidies indicators that exist already. Then I'll provide an overview of the indicator 12C1 I was just mentioning. And finally, I'll provide a bit of a summary of the current state of reporting. Next slide. So maybe it is important to remind ourselves of why we're measuring fossil fuel subsidies. It might go without saying, but given that very, very few countries are actually estimating and then fewer are actually reporting, I think it might be useful to sometimes state the obvious. So there are two key ideas here. The first is obviously to track progress at a global and national levels. And the second one that has been already a bit mentioned by previous speakers is first, that it provides an absolutely key source of information for policymakers. For example, on the fiscal costs, again, that was mentioned in one of the keynote speeches. The fiscal burden of fossil fuel subsidies is usually very large, to an extent that governments might not actually be entirely aware of. That's particularly true for some subsidies like tax cuts or other forms of foregone revenues that governments give upon, and though that's indeed tricky to estimate, but by highlighting this fiscal burden, that can be a very powerful motivator for reform, and that can be part of making that case for action that Susan was just mentioning. The second point being that we need robust evidence, as was said, to inform the development of a comprehensive reform plan, to inform the timeline, to inform the approach to sequencing. So I think policymakers in the room will know how crucial it is to inform good policy design with good preliminary analysis. And lastly, and really a key issue here, in order to make this reform fair, we need to be able to identify the main recipients in order to ensure that the more vulnerable households and also the more energy dependent sectors who are particularly vulnerable to price increases can obtain or retain really access to energy. So really, this is a fairly delicate reform process, and we need to have very solid data to design it. In the next slide, this is another view of a few of the available estimates of fossil fuel subsidies. As you can see, there are quite a few, and this is not exhaustive, but a lot of you might be familiar with the OECD inventory, of course, or with the International Energy Agency, the IEA, fossil fuel consumption subsidies report, which they publish annually. I won't go into detail of all of them, but maybe also mention at the bottom right of the screen, this is data published by Ireland, which is one of the countries who decided to not only report, but also publish on their statistics website fossil fuel subsidies annually. So there are quite a few, but here something to remember, and I'll move to the next slide for that, is that all of these estimates use slightly different methodologies for the measure of fossil fuel subsidies. I don't want to get too technical, but just to give a bit of an overview here, there are two main approaches for fossil fuel subsidies that are being used. The first one being the price gap approach, which measures the difference between the price set by the government and the price what would the price would be in a competitive market. And so this difference is the estimated subsidy. We call that induced transfers or price support. And that is the method that will be used, for example, by the IEA or the AMF. The second one being the inventory approach, which in this case consists in listing and quantifying individually each support measure. And so at the end, you just sum up the entire list of the measures, and that allows to have a more detailed view on which subsidies are used, how, and for who. And that would be the method used by the OECD in their inventory, as the name indicates. In the next slide, we can see that another difference in the methodologies, in the scopes, is that some estimates, for example, the AEA will focus on consumer subsidies, while the OECD listing will, on their side, also include producer subsidies, so having a slightly wider scope. Also differences in coverage, including electricity or not including electricity, including industries that are fossil fuel heavy, such as plastic, for example. So again, some differentiation between estimates, which make it difficult to compare across countries, those different indicators. Which brings me to my next slide and the SDG target 12C and the related indicator 12C1. So as part of the SDG framework, countries agreed to include the target 12C on the rationalization of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And of course, if you have a target, you want to have an indicator to measure it, which is this 12C1 amount of fossil fuel subsidies, production and consumption per unit of GDP. In the next slide, so again, as I mentioned, there was no, when the SDG framework was approved, there was no internationally approved method or definition for fossil fuel subsidies. So the first step was to establish a common approach for everyone to have, again, comparable data across countries, which led to the development of those guidelines you can see on the screen, which were prepared by UNEP, IISD, and OECD. UNEP being the custodian agency for the indicator, which makes us responsible for providing guidance to countries. And so here the choice was made to build on the different existing methodologies that I mentioned before, and really to capture as much information as possible. So countries are asked to report both through the inventory and the price gap methods. So that means that they cover a very wide array of subsidies. When it comes to the scope, for example, I'm just mentioning a few examples. When it comes to the scope, we decided to include indeed secondary commodities like electricity, and some aspects of the monitoring are encouraged but optional. For example, the fossil fuel heavy industry, as I was mentioning. So next slide, please. Just a quick note on that. Importance of country-led reporting. You might think that if we already have so many existing estimates, why bother countries and ask them to produce national level data when we already have a fairly wide global estimate? So in addition to the reason I mentioned previously of having comparable data, there are three other points I'd like to emphasize here. First, the need to build expertise at national level in order to design reforms for the repurposing of fossil fuel subsidies. We need to have at country level experts who know and understand the fiscal framework, how to reform it, and building this database is part of these efforts at national level to build this capacity to have people who understand very in-depthly the state of the fossil fuel subsidies framework in the country at national level. The second one being data access. Data might have access to countries might have access to internal data that we as international organizations do not have access to if the data is not public. And the last one is also quite important, ownership. Again, designing a fossil fuel subsidies reform is sensitive, it is politically complex, and it is really important that there is a high level of trust in the data that is being used. And that is part of this effort building ownership is part of this effort to make sure that countries rely on data that they have developed themselves and that they truly feel okay to rely on. In the next slide, I will be very brief on this because of time constraints, but you might want to go back to the slides later. Just to say that for the definition of fossil fuel subsidies, we relied for fossil fuel on the definition from the IEA statistical manual, and for subsidy, we use the WTO definition, which is a fairly wide definition for subsidies. Moving to the next slide, the reporting is done through list of subsidies. And so based on the agreed scope and the definition that I just mentioned, we have 3 types of subsidies that are recommended for reporting on this indicator, and the last one being mentioned, but we don't ask countries to report it at this stage. I'll explain one in a second. Again, without getting too technical, I'll just go through the different types of subsidies. The first one being direct transfers of government funds, and that is basically direct spending. Usually you can find that in national budget documents, and that is probably the easiest to track, and that refers to, it could be through cash transfers, it could be through government investments in state-owned enterprise in the oil and gas industry. The second one being induced transfers or price support, which I already mentioned previously on the price gap approach, which again consists in measuring the difference between the price set by the government, for example, through a price regulation mechanism, and what that price would be if there were no protection measures, and so that difference being the price support. So these 2 are compulsory. The third one, tax expenditure. This one is a bit trickier, and that was mentioned actually in one of the keynote speeches regarding the difficulty to finding this price reference, this benchmark level for the tax, what the tax would be if there was no tax break. So on this one, we recommend reporting, but as the methodological definitions are still evolving and being developed, we haven't made it compulsory at this stage, and it's actually great to hear that there is so much discussions happening around that. The last one, transfer of risk to government, that refers, for example, to to credit support or to debt cancellations. This is fairly difficult to measure due to lack of data availability, and so at this stage we do not ask countries to report. Last slide. Thank you. So on the current state of reporting, so I'm entering the last part of my presentation, we are aiming to build a database step by step. So we have at this stage these global estimates that we can build from the different existing reports from IEA, from OECD, etc. But now we really want to build a database at national level, at a more granular level. The data collection for this indicator was started in 2022. At this stage, we've taken an approach of annual reporting. This might evolve in the future. To be completely open with everyone, the level of reporting has been fairly low so far and has come primarily from OECD countries and mostly European countries. This is fairly easy to explain. It is a technical indicator, and the fact is that in particular in the case of non-OECD countries, countries do not have readily available national data. They need to start, so to say, from scratch, and that will require quite a bit of work. So this is something that we are aiming to build over time in the coming years. On a note that some countries have taken advantage of existing databases, and of course, so I mentioned the OECD inventory. Eurostat is also doing a lot of work on this topic, but that leaves aside some of the regions, and those regions will require additional support at national level to build those databases. When it comes to the process of reporting, so each government usually have an SDG focal point who is in charge of reporting to the science division of UNEP through the IRIS portal, which you might be familiar with. Some countries have decided to report through the OECD, which is also possible. So the OECD and the country work together to fill up the SDG indicator questionnaire, and then the OECD submits to us directly. This is completely fine. And another approach that we've taken is to work with a database called the Global Tax Expenditure Database, which is managed by the Council on Economic Policy, which is a think tank based in Switzerland. And they have accumulated a whole lot of data on tax expenditure based on public sources. And so we use this database to support countries in filling their questionnaires. So we're trying to see how to facilitate the filling of those questionnaires for countries and reduce the work burden. Now, on the last slide, maybe a few lessons learned, sorry. First, the need for intragovernmental coordination. So this is a big one. One of the difficulties of collecting data on fossil fuel subsidies is that they can be very scattered. Some of it might be under the Ministry of Finance in the Department of Tax or the Department of Budget. Some of it might be with the Ministry of Energy. Some of it might even be with the Ministry of Environment. So it's really spread out, and it requires a really big effort of coordination, internal coordination, and that's why we've seen for countries who submitted really complete data sets. They usually had put together, a workforce internally, a coordination effort between different ministries, and that is really key to success. The second one is that even in the data sets that were submitted, we saw really big data gaps. Sometimes countries saying, we've focused on this subsidy for now, and we'll extend the analysis to different types of subsidies in the future. So it can indeed be a work in progress, but this is probably important to highlight. Which leads to the third point, which is that we do need to increase, and by we, I mean international organizations and also partners such as IISD. We need to continue our efforts of capacity building at national level, working with statistics department, working with Ministry of Finance in this capacity to build together these data sets on fossil fuel subsidies, to discuss the definitions internally, etc. And finally, again, responding to the fairly low level at this stage of reporting, we need to continue communication on the importance of such reporting, which is ultimately what we're doing here today. So that's good news. And that's it for my presentation today, and I remain available for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. I appreciate that. It's a great summary of where we're at on SDG reporting. We have one more speaker. Mauricio Gutierrez is a researcher with the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, where he conducts research on carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform with a special emphasis on the role of social protection policies during the implementation process. He's involved in a project that aims to analyze carbon fiscal reforms designed to reduce poverty and inequality. Moreover, the project looks at the underlying differences in political and economic processes influencing reform implementation across industrialized and low and middle income countries. Previously worked at the Economic Policy Research Institute located in Cape Town, implementing a multi-country research study on social protection response to COVID-19 for UNICEF and the International Training Program on Social Protection and Sustainable Development. Mauricio, you're going to talk a little bit about the social side today, which is great, which is a nice balance to some of the technical things we've been speaking about. So over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and for the invitation. As already said, working at IDOS, our project is implemented with other partners, ETH Zurich, IISD, and UC Berkeley. And as pointed out, we are looking more at the political economy behind fossil fuel subsidy reforms and carbon pricing. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to locate us within the current environment of agreements. Fossil fuel subsidy reforms and carbon pricing form part of several agreements and communiques. For many years, governments have pledged to remove harmful subsidies, and we have seen this, for example, in the G7 leaders communique last year, which reaffirmed the ambition to eliminate these subsidies until 2025. Next slide, please. But we are not there yet. If we look, and this is very similar to the data just presented by UNDP, we see that subsidies are increasing, especially since 2020. The challenge of reforming subsidies is getting bigger, and we see that increasingly, governments right now use subsidies to protect the citizens. That's also due to the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, which increased global energy prices. We also see that governments have postponed some other interventions like carbon pricing initiatives that also are important and form part of the communiques. So if you go to the next slide, we see that only a very few countries have subsidy reforms within the NDCs. Overall, 12 commit to NDC in the NDCs to reforming subsidies, and several of these pledges are rather aspirational. So in the past days, I've been participating in a few of the events here at SP58, and interestingly enough, in each event that I participated in, at one point, a delegate mentioned subsidy reforms as a big opportunity for working closer to our ambitions in the Paris Climate Agreement. So this gives hope for accelerated reform implementation. But next slide, please. You might ask yourselves, why is it so difficult to commit to fossil fuel subsidies? So let us go to the next slide and have a look at the reform process. This is a framework that we developed in our research project to answer the question how to phase out of subsidy reforms and also implement carbon pricing. And we want to ask or answer the questions, for example, what's the role of compensatory measures and how can they be best designed? And specifically, we are looking at the political economy factors behind the actual carbon reform. So what are country cases that we see historically that have tried to reform carbon fossil fuel subsidies? And as you can see from the figures that I put in front of you, that's, I guess, takes 5 minutes to go through. It's a fairly complex process. And we might, I'm not going to be able to go through all of this right now, but I want to point out one specific benefit that fossil fuel subsidy reforms, when implemented, create for countries. Please, next slide. That's perfect. And that's specifically the revenue use and complementary policy aspect, which highlights the subsidy reform, relationship between subsidy reforms and social policies, which also my colleague from UNDP just mentioned that social protection is a key priority for the recycling of the funds that get available after reforming a subsidy. So if you go to the next slide, we see that, or we can clearly see that subsidies are inefficient to reduce poverty. If you look on to the graph on the right-hand side, you see that subsidies are quite regressive. Most of the subsidies benefit the fourth and fifth quintile in the income distribution. And we also see that compared to cash transfers, subsidies are much more expensive because for each US dollar that wants to be transferred on average to a vulnerable or poor household, governments need to spend $12 on subsidies compared to cash transfers where the investment is $2 for each USD transferred. This is a specific example for Latin America and the Caribbean. So next slide. Perfect. So this brings me to the conclusion, or leads to the first conclusion that I want to highlight, that cash transfers are much more efficient than subsidies, specifically than re-referring to social protection. So let us look at specific examples for this. Next slide, please. We see that in these 6 examples that social protection measures taken by countries benefited mostly poor and vulnerable in the society. We see that exchanging subsidies for cash transfers can have a positive impact on poverty and also reduces government or public expenditure on subsidy reforms. If we take the example of Dominican Republic, the 2 cash transfer programs that were implemented there reached 40% of the poorest of society, which is a complete turnaround compared to the first or the previous slide I was showing you. Next slide, please. I want to make a quick detour here because for our project, and this is not specifically the question today, but it's interesting to see that carbon pricing revenues have not been recycled yet so much into social protection, which leaves the opportunity for answering here also interesting questions on increasing public acceptability for carbon pricing measures if the revenues of carbon pricing would be recycled into social protection. But this is something where we see an interconnection between fossil fuel subsidy reforms and carbon pricing, which I think one has to see both of them to really work towards the goals that we have. But as said, this is not for this session maybe the main focus. If we move to the next slide, I want to go into the important conclusions here. And that is that we see a bidirectional relationship between social protection and fossil fuel subsidies. On the one hand, the implementation of social protection after fossil fuel subsidies addresses distributional problems and increases equity. And they also improve the acceptability and, importantly, the trust in government in the implementation of these reforms, which can lead also in cases where social protection has not been used to social protest and where vulnerable households suffer much more from the removal of subsidy reforms than richer households. So they are also, to go to the last point here on the slide, the great fit for global south countries because some of them have underdeveloped tax systems, not giving them the same opportunity as, for example, richer countries to implement other types of measures to reallocate money. So cash transfers or social protection specifically can help these countries. And on my last slide, I want to also show the other side of this bidirectional relationship, because subsidy reforms can also improve social protection infrastructure, social protection systems. If you look, for example, at countries with single registries that have been built up, Jordan is a great example. They're combining different databases to better target vulnerable. These can also be used afterwards. In the case of shocks, these can be used afterwards to better target other social protection programs, making the social protection system of the country stronger and helping them with other challenges. This is on the efficiency side of social protection, but also on the equity side we see big advantages, because these investments in social policies in the long term strengthen human development as well as also social cohesion. There's a great opportunity for these countries then to move forward actually with advanced social protection systems that can be built or that are a result of fossil fuel subsidy reforms implemented. I don't want to say in the correct way because there's no correct way, but if implemented to the country's needs in the country-specific context, let's say it like this. This was my last slide. I'm looking forward to discussing with the other speakers. Thank you very much for listening, and I also want to quickly thank our donor, German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, for their support in this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. So we've had a wide sort of reflection on how these issues are being developed. We've had some technical discussion, some more sort of political reality type of discussion. I'll open it up. If we've got about 20 minutes left, if there are some questions from the audience, I think we've got a microphone we can pass along. So I don't know if anybody wants to just put up their hand. We've got a hand here in the front. Jonas, do you have a microphone? Please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Sure. So thank you for the opportunity. My name is Anton Svetov. I used to be a negotiator in the UNEP for carbon markets and also did G20 climate track and some other multilaterals on climate policy. I'm currently consulting for an international comparative law research center. So my question is to all the panelists who would be ready to answer that, but maybe specifically for Mauricio because he touched upon this issue in his presentation. So I wanted to ask about the actual international consensus about fossil fuel subsidy reform and the need for it. the language that was on Mauricio's slide from the COP decisions, I mean, we know that basically the international commitment there, that's a very soft word I use, but very strong word I use to call it a commitment. But the commitment hasn't changed in language since 2009, essentially, right? So we're still using very old text, which reflects the lack of progress, lack of commitment. We still have the word in the medium term there for the last 14 years there. And I wanted to ask, how important is that to actual fossil fuel subsidy reforms in countries? Is it something that is crucial to move things forward, or are countries basically realizing that they have to do it anyway and they're moving on despite the weak international consensus on that? And if so, where and how maybe that consensus could be strengthened or built, if not the G20 or the UNEP? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Mauricio, before you tackle that question and invite the others as well, I'm going to add on one other element, and this is relating to that language, is this issue of inefficiency that sort of hangs on as a qualifier in many of these texts. So to the three panelists also, sort of in addition to the general question, your thoughts on this term inefficiency. So Mauricio, maybe we'll start with you.
Thank you very much for that question. And yeah, it's a very interesting question. For me, I'm very happy to be part of this SB58 right now. Our research does not focus on how the consensus is built. And from the first insights that I get in building the database that I described on the fossil fuel subsidy reform cases, I have noticed that most of the reforms took place in relationship with the IMF. Have had as a political driver fiscal problems of countries, and were in the end more a challenge that countries needed to tackle in order, for example, to get an INF credit. I don't want to say, because our research is still being implemented, so there is yet no causal relationship, but from the first insights that I'm getting, it's interesting to see that the political driver behind subsidy reforms seems to be not social, or in very few cases social. In none of the cases that I have seen right now environmental, but mostly fiscal, economic. So this to the question, where does the drive come from for subsidy reforms? And on the inefficiency language, yeah, I formed part of our last year of our team for the G7, and we wrote together the comprehensive assessment report of commitments, and we saw in this that there are a lot of countries' specific views that keep this language every year in the commitments, even though a lot of countries want to remove it. But I agree. I don't think that this is a way on how to promote actual reform processes. And if we really want to move forward, I think it would be crucial to change these views, because they distract from the real problem. Mm-hmm. Next to the speaker, please.
Yeah. Definitely, thanks. Just to agree with my previous speaker, obviously, just to add, I think the area of fossil fuel subsidies is probably one of the strongest, where we see like this strong contrast between what appears to be like a global consensus and to the reality that we see in countries. I mean, obviously, this is subject to national legislation. What we from UNDP side do is to support countries trying to see the benefits of doing this. There's a couple of work streams within our work where this translates into activities. There's a work stream on energy, a work stream on just transition, a work stream on green recovery, helping countries to rebuild in a greener way after the pandemic. But I would definitely concur with the previous speaker that the motivation that we see is not really that this is in response to decisions being taken at the global level, but rather like fiscal considerations of like, ending either wasteful consumption or like fiscal considerations of spending existing money in a more efficient way. Yeah, definitely.
Claire, did you want to comment?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just one small additional point relating to the theme of my presentation on reporting reporting on the indicator, we see that we have heard from some countries that they're waiting to see what other countries will do when it comes to reporting. And to me, that's quite telling. There's still there's an agreement that something needs to be done, but there's a form of shyness when it comes to being transparent on the use of fossil fuel subsidies. So that's in itself, I think, quite telling. And I'll stop here.
Thanks. And just briefly on our perspective at IISD on this term of inefficiency is we've been asked by a number of countries and organizations over the years, how would you define inefficiency? And when it first started to come up, we thought about it a lot, and then we decided, well, it's not on us to define inefficiency. The countries that are promoting this term should be the ones to define it and tell us why your fossil fuel subsidies are efficient. Because my own personal take is, by nature, a fossil fuel subsidy would seem to be inefficient. Sure, there might be some very limited examples where you could have a time-limited subsidy for support to deliver something really, very urgent, some of the COVID recovery measures being an example of that. But a lot of these subsidies are in place for years or even decades without much consideration or review. So for us, the view is if countries want to continually use inefficient, the onus should be on them to define exactly what inefficient means, because they're the ones that want to use this term. Do we have other questions in the audience? We have time for one or two more if we have some hands. No? No other comments? I might, feel free to put up your hand, but I might have one question. It was one that actually somebody from a party delegation asked me yesterday that I'll put to our panel of experts. And they said, well, look, we're negotiating this text. We're aware that there's a low number of NDCs that have fossil fuel subsidy reform in them. We want to increase that. We want to build momentum. We know the situation with the SDG reporting. What can we do? And so maybe for my three panelists, what advice would you have for negotiators who are supportive of including fossil fuel subsidy reform and want to increase those NDC and SDG reporting numbers? How and where should they be looking to push this issue within the text, and what might they focus on? And it doesn't even necessarily have to restrict to text, but maybe in the overall broader climate process. So I don't know if somebody wants to go first. Would you like to go first? Sure.
Sure, and thank you. Yes, I would say that this would regard to one other work stream that UNDP has been developing recently, and which is on transparency. As we know, the issue of transparency, both of climate action as well as of transparency of finance, has been increasing on many countries' agendas and also throughout the negotiations here. And I think my immediate response would be that it helps countries to transparently show their efforts towards implementing their NDC if they can precisely showcase that they are not spending a considerable amount of their own national budget into a brown agenda. So, and I do know it always sounds very much straightforward, and it may be in practice in countries. We've heard also from the previous speaker from UNEP, being very specific about the different types of subsidies that actually exist and how difficult they may be to track depending on what form they actually have. But I would say it's this type of transparency work in which we are working with a whole set of countries precisely on this issue, which helps. It may sound like a formality, maybe like transparency and data and all of that, but actually what it does in practice is it helps countries to showcase very clearly whether they're actually living up to their promises and whether they're spending their national finance in an efficient and in a green way, or whether they are still further apart from that. So yeah, my response would be on transparency work.
Thank you. Maybe Mauricio, I'll go to you next, and then Claire, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be brief on this because, as said, my research focus and also my expertise does not lie in consensus. I think what we can learn from the framework that I showed is that if countries want to really engage in fossil fuel subsidy reforms, the preparation and motivation is quite important. What I pointed out, the driver of the reform should be analyzed. And this brings me to maybe a hypothesis that I developed for myself, that if subsidy reforms really want to contribute to our achievement of the Paris Climate Agreement, they need to be interconnected with more complementary reforms. This is, for example, in fossil fuel consumption, the phasing of actual fossil fuels and building renewable energy, because just removing fossil fuel subsidies, as we see in the case of Mexico, maybe the best, which has removed very successfully fossil fuel subsidies, but has not decreased their fossil fuel consumption right now. This is something where actually the ambition, where does that end? What's the end goal needs to be strengthened. And yeah, I will leave it at this.
Thank you. Claire.
Yeah, thanks. I guess, yeah, there are two sides of, in regards to reporting, which is what I'll focus on here. There are really two sides of it, which is one being political. It is politically sensitive. As I mentioned, some countries prefer to observe rather than report at this stage. And I think on that front, it's important, one, for countries who have taken the lead on reporting to be quite vocal about it, and try and encourage others. And I mean, internally, there's probably some lobbying to be done. The other aspect being more technical, and on that I touched upon it a little bit. There's a need for coordination inside governments. Ministries tend to work in silos, and the really successful cases of reporting we've seen was really when within the country, a form of working group was put together to break those silos. Another thing that I could encourage countries to do, and member of countries, is to reach out to us. We have accumulated a number of training materials, and we can also provide technical support. So yeah, if that is the problem, this is something that we could work on at a bilateral manner. And that's it for me.
Thank you. I'll do one last chance in case I see any hands, but if not, then I think we might move on to sort of our last interjections, because we are getting close to the end. So I'll give everybody sort of one last sort of closing comment, and maybe something to think about, which you can address or feel free to pass on. Because I know that we've seen momentum up and down a little bit in regards to fossil fuel subsidy reform, and in times of high energy prices, it can be particularly stressful. But an area where we have seen some growing momentum is on the discussion related to just transition. We've got work plan discussions going on now. So maybe in a combination of any final remarks you'd like to give, I'd also appreciate any thoughts that you or your organizations might have had on where fossil fuel subsidy reform can fit into just transition, and if not, then that's okay too. But I just thought I'd throw it out there, and maybe we'll go reverse order. So Claire, I'll go to you first, then Marisa, then Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll be brief. I think I'll just emphasize once and for all the importance of building strong data when it comes to informing fair, inclusive policy. It's simple and straightforward, but this is really the key message here. Thank you.
Thank you for also putting subsidy reforms into the bigger picture, because I think, and this is something that was discussed as a technical workshop on just transition on Monday, if I'm not mistaken, we have seen that fossil fuel subsidy reforms can form part of this just transition process, specifically GIZ in this sense, at a very comprehensive understanding of just transition, because just transition can be a buzzword. We have to be very careful how we define it. I liked a lot the GIZ definition, because it not only focused on the energy transition, but general transition, systematic transformation towards sustainable way of life. And within this, I think subsidy reforms can be a starting point, because they make a contribution to our ambitions to reduce greenhouse gases. They bring funding, and this funding can then be reinvested, because one of the big challenges that was communicated by party delegates during this roundtable was also that they lack funding, that they don't know how to finance the just transition process. So this could be a good starting point, in my opinion, and then moving forward, as countries like I already mentioned, Mexico, have done it, to then on top put carbon pricing, implement taxes on carbon to again have more resources available to invest in complementary measures, which can be social protection, but not only. Renewable energy investments, I think, are important. And then and this might be my idealistic view of the world, we have to rethink structures in general, because just moving from one energy to another doesn't change the problems that we are having right now. We have to rethink the structures that we build up on our whole way of living, and I think it's going to be important there to be very ambitious and see fossil fuel subsidy reforms, as I said, as a starting point. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in addition to what I was saying earlier, definitely I would say that fossil fuel subsidies is seen at UNDP as one element of what countries can and should do under their just transition work. There is currently, as I mentioned, a work stream going on from UNDP that is working with around 10 countries right now on just transition. And it means just transition on different levels, as we heard. It means just transition on the social side of what it means if you're really turning, really transforming a whole economy. It means the ecological side. It means, of course, the economic, the fiscal side. So to be more specific, one example from Vietnam being one of the countries participating there. And this is happening also in close collaboration with other international partners, including GIZ, including World Bank, including others. Vietnam is working on a whole package on how to transition justly, and that includes element of increasing e-mobility, also in terms of the fiscal areas under which the fossil fuel subsidies would come, and further more economic incentives legally on how to incentivize sustainable production and consumption. I'll leave it here and happy to follow up individually with anyone interested. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Thank everybody again for giving us your Saturday morning, early afternoon. And I know it's been a long week, but we don't want to lose sight on the importance of fossil fuel subsidy reform in this process and other processes as well. I think we've had some good technical interventions, some political ones earlier on, and so thank you very much. We will be reposting this this event on YouTube on IISD's channel. So if somebody you know missed it, wants to catch it, or you'd like to see the presentations again, it will be online. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at IISD, whether it's about this event or any of our events on fossil fuel subsidy reform, or questions about the Friends group as well. So with that, thank you to our speakers, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.